talk about sewing today. It's an important skill that I learned early on in life from my mom and my grandmas. They spent a lot of time making dresses and costumes and uniforms and things for me growing up, so I was familiar with taking a piece of fabric and turning it into something that you could wear by knowing how to use the machine. And I'm lucky to be able to do that here at Design Concepts as well. Sometimes we need to make soft goods designs or prototypes that require fabric, a lot of industrial fabric. And that's why we have this industrial machine here. But it's been a really important tool in my life. I created a soft goods backpack for part of my Master's of Industrial Design thesis. I created my wedding dress that I wore, a little non-traditional thing when I got married. And although I'm not a fashion or fabric designer, more of a seamstress or a hobbyist really, it's a really important skill to be able to tackle projects that might be hard to find for different sizes of people or different situations in your home. Like I need a blackout curtain that fits this size and out of this fabric, and I can think of those projects and do them at home, which is a great thing. And it's really just understanding the machine and being able to sew relatively straight, and you'll be able to do most things that you want to do. A lot of the off-the-shelf clothes don't work for me very well, so having to hem and take things in and take sleeves up and things like that, those are really simple things that you can do with a sewing machine that really just require an iron and knowing how to do a straight stitch. So I'm going to walk you through that today. We're going to make a little pouch. It's a pretty easy first project. And sewing's kind of like a foreign language when you start learning it. There's a lot of weird words that are that have to do with the machine or the tools that you use that I'll go through. And you really learn it little by little, just like a language. So you don't decide to learn French and then go to class and then start speaking in full sentences and having a conversation. You learn the words, you learn the vocabulary, you learn how to conjugate verbs. And so when you start learning how to sew, you should pick a really simple project and do that first, and then keep adding projects and upping your complexity, because you'll learn a new thing every time you sew, all the way up to the project that I just finished, which was this winter coat. It was a pretty big project. It took about a month and a half to finish from when I got the fabric through wearing it. And the reason I wanted to create a winter coat is because I just couldn't find one that was my style or fit me well or was warm enough for these Wisconsin winters. So I have a puffy coat, it works fine, but when you get to those negative 20-degree days, and now that I walk to work every day, that just wasn't cutting it. So I decided, like I do when I think of a project in my head, oh, how can I make this better, and how can I adjust this and add some features? So some of the things that I added to my winter coat, I started with a pattern from Waffle Patterns, which is a shop on Etsy, and you download a PDF of the pattern and you can turn on just the sizes that you need and then print that out. So traditional patterns, when, say, my grandma or my mom bought them to make things for me, they come with all the lines for all of the sizes, and so I forgot to turn them off when I printed here in the office. But the nice thing about the PDFs is that you can choose which size you'd like to print out and then cut only those lines. So reading patterns is a pretty advanced thing, so that's why we'll start with just some pillowcase, straight line kind of projects. But when you get up to garments that work around your curves of your body, there's a lot of different steps and phases you go through in order to create something that works and doesn't look all off-center and wobbly. So I started with that pattern, and I cut all 22 pieces out, and I decided to add a lining, so that added a few more pieces. I also wanted to add some special details like backpack straps, so when you're walking around in a store and it's -20 outside, but it's 65 inside, you don't have to schlep your coat, giant heavy coat around. You can put the straps on your shoulders and it hangs there. Some other features are the waterproof material. This is waterproof suiting on the hood, the yokes, and the shoulders. And I did some top stitching because I did add another layer of fabric so it wouldn't rustle around in there. The piping is reflective red because I walk to work and it's dark when I leave the office. So I thought around my the little details on the side here around the hood and the back were good areas for that. I decided to lengthen the coat from the original pattern. So that's using a technique called slashing, where you extend the part of the pattern from a certain angle in a certain part of the along the grain line, because if you added just inches at the bottom, it would change the proportion of the coat. So these are things that I just YouTubed and found out how to do. And the materials I chose were it's kind of a new material. It's a jersey affixed to a wool backing. So inside this is wool, and it's a jersey, so it has a nice drape and has a cool color, because although there are thousands of millions of types of fabrics out there, the fabric is really important and will change the way you sew something and the way it lays on your body and how it holds up in different weather and things like that. So, I really wanted a different color than just the basic neutrals and blacks that all the winter coats come in. So I found this turquoise in this nice wool material. I talked about the waterproof suiting on the top and the faux fur lining for the hood. And the inside is a quilted poly. And in between those layers are a thinsulate layer. So I got to learn how to do that. And inside the sleeves are satin, so that your sweaters and things don't get bunched up in there. So yeah, it took me about a month and a half, and I worked on the weekends like every day, all day long, because it was September when I started, and I really wanted it by the time it got sub-freezing. And once I get going on a project, I just kind of love the industrial doing parts at a time and it all coming together piece by piece. So the dress form is a really helpful tool for sewing. They make them at a certain size, and then you can buy padding kits that you can kind of pad it so it's your measurements, and that helps when you try things on and make sure it's the right size and laying the right way for your person. Some of the other tools that you need when you start sewing are some fabric-only shears. It's really important that you don't use them on paper and other materials too, or else they'll dull quickly, and that's no fun. Pins. I like the long ones with I think these are quilting pins, but I like them because they're easy to grab and work with. Measuring tape. This is called a sewing gauge, and it helps you when you're folding over your hems and finding your seam allowances. So you can, like if you're doing curtains, it's usually like a 3-inch hem, and you can go along the bottom and make sure it's all even along the way. And then the best tool, one of the most important tools that you end up using a lot is the seam ripper, because sewing is all about making mistakes. And the nice thing about it is it's not like gluing things together where you have to start with new materials. You can undo the seams that maybe it wasn't the right order of things and you have to put something else on first and then sew it together, or you just couldn't sew straight that one time. I can never sew straight. That's a myth. You can't I mean, when you look at things that you buy off the shelf, these are done by like robots. So you expect really steady lines on your hems and things like that. And if you look closely at this coat, they're not steady, but it's, you know, it's all right. It's homemade, and I'm proud of it. But yeah, seam ripper will help a lot. Some extra tools that that you could purchase are things like pinking shears, which help when you're using fabric that frays, and the wheel cutter for if you're doing long strips of things, and especially like curtains and drapes and like the long straight edges of the jacket and things like that. This is the machine I bought when I got my first job out of grad school. I saved up for it, and I really liked it because it was maroon. It's also an older model. I think it's in the late 60s, early 70s. So I like being able to look inside and know how it works, so I can fix it if the timing goes off, or I can really dial in the tension, and it's just a little hardier, so I can get through some of the weird things that I decide to sew through, like layers and layers of wool with some elastic and some thinsulate. So that sewing this area was pretty tough when you got down to it. So I was glad to have that machinery. But with that, comes the need to really learn some of those words and some of that language of sewing, because you have to know where the thread goes to thread it, and how the bobbin, which is the lower thread. So sewing is really an upper thread and a lower thread that swap places in time so that it makes a knot inside the two layers of fabric. So that's really what sewing is, and you can have control over the length of the stitch and the zigzag, the width of the stitch, and those are different. That's basically all you need is zigzag and straight stitch. There are lots of things like sergers, which produce those really nice edges in your t-shirts and things like that on the stretchy materials like jersey, but those are expensive, and I don't really know how they work, so I'll just stick with what I know. For the office, we do a lot of prototyping, soft goods prototyping, which includes webbing and lots of layers of industrial fabrics. So we purchased this Sailrite industrial machine. It is industrial. It has this large wheel on the side, which gives it the power to get through those thick fabrics, but it's unique in that it's a tabletop version. A lot of the industrial machines are built into the tables, and because several people know how to sew here, and you sometimes need to move around to different project rooms, this was what I thought would work best for us. And it's pretty basic. It does straight stitch and zigzag. You can control the length with a lever on the front, and you can control the zigzag with a side lever at the top. But the benefit is that the large wheel can go through a lot of layers. And I decided to name it Ferdinand. Sailrite is a company that's used mostly for watercraft textiles like sails and thick canvas for the seats and things. So I thought Ferdinand Magellan, like sailing around the world, and also Ferdinand the Bull, because it's pretty tough. So we have some extra things. This is a binding tool where you can take 1-inch binding elastic or twill tape, and it could feed right onto the fabric when you're sewing a hem or sewing an edge. And that's nice for some of these prototypes where we use different stretchy fabrics and different fabrics that come together, and it adds a nice binding, and it saves us a lot of time, because the other tool that's really important in sewing is your iron. The main way to screw up a hem is to try to do it by eye not measure it, not pin it, and not iron it first. And because when you're going through a project like this coat, you get excited and you want to put those sleeves together, or put that binding together, and not take the time to really use the iron to press your edges and seams first. And it makes a world of difference, because when you know you're not going to be able to sew exactly straight, when the seam has been pressed beforehand, it makes it a lot easier to stay as straight as you can. Let's see. Any questions about the coat or Fernand before I go into the demonstration? Right.
Do you get all your fabric around here, or do you have to go elsewhere?
A little of both. Gay Feather Fabrics is a really nice local store, and they have quite a bit of things, even though it's a really tiny store. But they don't have a lot of the industrial kinds of elastic-y stuff that we need for our prototypes here. So we go to Joann's for a lot of that. And then online, I bought all of my fabrics from Mood, because I wanted to pretend like I was in my own personal Project Runway. And that's the fabric store that they use in that show, and Tim Gunn goes, and they get half an hour, and it's amazing. I went when I visited in New York last time, and it's amazing. So, but it's tough. The fabrics are really an important part of choosing what you're going to sew and how successful you'll be at it. If you're first starting out, try to stay away from the stretchy things. Those are really difficult, and they require different types of needles, like a ballpoint needle for your machine, and different threads, and they're just really tough to work with. So try something that's like a cotton-based, or canvas, or duck cloth, or something like that, so that you don't get frustrated when you're first starting to learn. Let's see. I talked a little bit about the machine, the basics. When you start sewing on a machine, especially the older ones or the more industrial ones, you need to know how to thread the needle and thread the machine. And it is a little complicated, so I can show you guys one at a time when you try something, when you work on your own. But you can always go on YouTube, and it'll show you step by step about where things go. So this one goes from the spool to the pigtail, and down through a set of holes into the most important part, which is the tensioning plates. And so it slides in there and catches another wire, and then gets threaded through the top thread guide here, and then threads down here through the needle and out. And then inside is the bobbin case. So this one has a metal case. That the bobbin rests in. And you can wind it up here through the machine. And if you place it in here the right way, oops, that one broke. So the bobbin has a tension as well. So this little tiny little screw is what you can do little small adjustments or quarter turns to get the tension correct for the bottom, so that the knot is in between the fabric and not through the bottom or through the top of the fabric. So that's what the tensioning plates here and the bobbin tension does, is to be equal tension, so that the knot's in the right place, and you don't get those like loops, or it doesn't slip stitches or get, it's called a rat's nest. Sometimes it'll bundle up at the bottom in here, and you have to cut it out, and it sucks. So with this one, you put your bobbin thread in, and you have to wind, it always twirls this way, and you can pull the bobbin thread up and out. So it's threaded through the top, and the bobbin's threaded, and you're ready to go. I checked the tension on this already, so it's good to go. Sometimes if you the tension goes off if you change the different fabrics that you're working with. So always do a test run before you start. And what else about tension? I think that's it. It's basically it. Once it seems complicated to get the threads in the right place and the right tension, but once you have that, all you really need to know is how to sew a straight line. So we're going to do that here. This little pouch is 3 pieces. It's 1 square of fabric and 2 smaller squares of fabric, or they're rectangles, I guess. I've already pressed the hems, and the idea is that we'll layer the 3 pieces so that you can open it up, small scale pillow or a sachet, like my grandma would put lavender in here and stick it in her underwear drawer. So that's, yeah, that's how you start. So I've already done a little bit there. Well, maybe in your mountain biking bag or something like that. That'd be nice. So this part of the machine is called the feed dog footplate. Footplate? I don't know. What's it called? It's a foot. Yeah. I know one's a feed dog and one's a foot. So the feed dog or foot thing helps walk the fabric through the machine. So you'll always set it down before you start sewing. And I like to drop the needle into my fabric before I start sewing. And then you use the pedal at the bottom to control the speed of the motor. And you'll hear it go. Oh, and then other thing to do before you start stitching is to trap the stitches so they don't get sucked in and make those rat's nest I was talking about. And so. Et voila. So what I did there was I spun the wheel until the needle came out of the fabric at the top of the stitch and released the foot. And then you just trim off the extra threads. And these little hems didn't have to be super straight, but I do want the next part to be straight so that the pillows are even sides and don't make rhombuses or other shapes. So to do that, it's important to pin your fabrics in place, and the mantra is right sides together, always pin, and watch your line and not your needle. So the seam allowance for this is a 1/2 inch, and that's a typical seam allowance for any project. So I want to sew a 1/2 inch inside of my fabric, and so the sewing gauge will show me that if I drop the needle down, it'll match up to this line that's printed on the plate here. So I want to have my eye on that line and keeping the edge of the fabric on that line and not the needle, because it helps you sew much straighter. So I pinned the right sides together, which means the inside, the good sides are facing each other, and the extra edges are, and the opposite side are out. And you drop the needle down, and because I want to lock my stitches this time, and that means going reverse for a little bit, so that makes the stitches stay in place. So I'm going to push down on this lever here after I start sewing for a couple threads. So I just reversed and kept sewing. I'm going to sew, take the needles out as I go. When you get to a corner, when you think you're about a ½ inch away from the top, you bury the needle, raise the foot, and spin the fabric, and that's how you keep it in the right place. So I need to go one more stitch. And then when I twist it around, it lines up right with the line. And you sew again. Same thing on this corner. I feel like sewing with Nancy. This is great. Those of you not from Wisconsin might not have known that Sewing with Nancy was a show on PBS where this very nice lady in Kankakee or some Appleton area place has a shop, and she just is lovely. And I have a friend who's a textile designer who got to meet her, which is pretty cool. Last twist. And then you lock the stitches again when you're done. And that's it. You can pull your stitches away, or your piece away. And I used a darker thread so you could see it. So that's it. And then you can trim the corners away so they don't bunch inside when you flip it. Inside out. And then you set your stitches with the iron. And that's it. Yay!